The water closed over my head before I could even scream. Cold, but heavy. And just before I sank, I heard one of them laugh. "Don't worry," a voice whispered. "She'll be gone in seconds. Then we get the 11 million. My name is Eleanor Matthews, though most people call me Grandma Eleanor. I'm 78 years old. I never imagined that the children I once rocked to sleep, the grandchildren who hugged my knees and called me Grandma, would one day will me to the edge of my own lake and push me in like I was nothing but an old, inconvenient object. Before I tell you how I survived, before I explain the betrayal that still aches in the marrow of my bones, I need you to understand who I was before that night, before the fear, before the silence, before family became strangers wearing familiar faces. Sit with me. Let an old woman open her diary and her heart. I grew up beside this same lake, Lake Alder. When I was a girl, the summers smelled like pine needles and lemon soap. My mother dried laundry on a rope line behind the house while humming old hymns, and my father built us a small dock with his own hands. My childhood was full of soft sounds. The creak of the screen door, the chirp of cicadas, the gentle knocking of wooden boats against the shore. Sometimes I close my eyes and feel it all again, the warm moss under my feet, the smooth oars in my hands, the sunlight flickering across the water like broken gold. I was a strong swimmer once, the kind who could cut through the lake before sunrise. Time took that from me, arthritis, a minor stroke, the slow, steady weakening of age. I spent the last few years in a wheelchair. At least, that's what they thought mattered. Henry, my late husband, used to tell me, "Ellie, you're quiet, but quiet people survive storms other folks never see coming." I didn't know how right he was. The trouble didn't start with the lake. It began with money. More specifically, $11 million. Everything Henry spent a lifetime building, his insurance, investments, properties, he left to me. Quietly, privately. I never flaunted it. I lived simply, wearing old sweaters and chipped china, content with small pleasures. I thought humility would protect me from greed. But greed does not need an invitation. The first warning came through my grandson Thomas. A sweet boy once, dimples, good manners, always the favorite student. But charm is a thin blanket. It doesn't hide the cold forever. One afternoon, as he straightened the blanket on my lap, he asked casually, "Grandma, have you ever thought about what happens to all your money when you're gone?" I laughed lightly, thinking he was asking a philosophical question. But he didn't laugh. His eyes flicked toward the medical bills on my side table. His jaw tightened. Then he leaned close enough for me to smell the mint gum he always chewed. "We just want to make sure you're secure, Grandma." Secure. The word felt wrong coming from him. Measured. Calculated. At first it was small changes. The way they hovered. The way they watched. They unplugged my phone for safety. They insisted on handling my mail. My pill trays were rearranged, too rearranged. Then came the accidents. One morning my wheelchair brakes were mysteriously left unlocked. The ramp outside became slippery after rain, yet the rest of the porch was completely dry. The fire alarm was removed to change the battery, and was never put back. Every concern was dismissed. Every accident was a joke. Every question answered with a smile too tight to be real. Betrayal rarely arrives with a roar. It arrives quietly, like termites eating away at the beams beneath your feet. A voice inside me whispered, "Eleanor, you are in danger." So I began writing everything down, this very diary entry included. It was a thin moon night, barely a sliver. They said they were taking me out for some fresh air. They wheeled me toward the dock where my father once lifted me by the waist and taught me how to float. I smelled gasoline faintly, maybe from the boat, maybe from something else. Thomas stood behind me. His girlfriend, Celine, held my blanket. Both wore gloves. Gloves. In June. "This won't take long," Thomas muttered. And then a shove, a violent splash, and the crushing shock of ice-cold water. The weighted wheelchair dragged me down fast. Very fast. But I did not die. Because there was one thing they never asked, never cared to know. Even at 78, after a stroke, after losing so much, I can still swim. The shock of the water didn't hit me all at once. It crawled up my skin like 1,000 icy needles. Instinct took over before fear did. My lungs knew what to do before my mind remembered how. I bent forward, twisted my wrists, and kicked downward with the little strength still left in these old legs. The weighted wheelchair dragged faster than I expected, pulling me deeper into a cold, echoing blue silence. For a moment I couldn't tell which way was up. My ears rang with the pressure. My eyes stung. My breath began to thin. But something inside me, something stubborn, something Henry always said would outlive my body, pushed through the panic. I braced my feet on the frame of the chair and shoved with everything I had. Years of swimming came back in jagged flashes. I remembered summers when I was young, the underwater game where Henry would hold his breath longer just to impress me. I remembered the way my father would clap when I learned to dive. I remembered the day my own daughter, Claire, learned to float with her tiny hands gripping my shoulders. All those memories rose with me, pushing my mind upward until my body followed. My hand found the buckle around my waist holding me to the chair, latched tight, deliberate, cruel. The metal was slippery beneath my fingers. The cold made my joints scream. I cursed myself for letting them fasten the belt earlier that evening. "Just to keep you steady, Grandma," said with that sweet poisonous smile. I dug my nails under the buckle and pulled. It didn't move. I tried again. It held. My lungs burned. Black spots clouded the edges of my vision. I could almost hear Henry's voice telling me, "Ellie, don't you give up. You hold on." I clenched my teeth, twisted the latch as hard as my arthritic fingers allowed, and suddenly, click. The belt snapped free. I floated upward like I'd been released from the jaws of a predator. My legs kicked, weak but determined, pushing through the pull of the lake's depth. I rose toward the trembling silver surface above me, toward air, toward life, toward one last chance. When my head finally broke the surface, I sucked in a ragged breath so loud it startled even me. The night sky looked enormous, almost unreal, the stars smeared like wet paint across black canvas. I treaded water quietly, barely moving, just listening. I expected to hear screaming. I expected to hear panic. I heard soft voices. Come. Whispering. "Do you think she sank already?" Celine asked, her voice trembling with a strange excitement. "Of course she did," Thomas said, with that same practiced certainty he used whenever he lied. "She couldn't swim if her life depended on it. Grandma hasn't walked in years, she's not going anywhere." They were still on the dock. I could see their silhouettes against the lake house lights, two young figures standing shoulder to shoulder, looking down into the water as if watching a stone sink. Neither of them knew the truth, that the helpless old woman they threw into the lake was quietly treading water just a few yards away, hidden in shadow. They waited a few minutes, whispering strategy. Their words floated over the water like poison drifting through air. "So, we call it in?" Celine asked. "Not yet," Thomas said. "We need to get back to the house first. Make it look like we weren't here." "What about the cameras?" "I wiped them an hour ago." The matter-of-fact way he said it made my stomach twist, not with fear but with a grief deeper than drowning. This was my grandson. This was the boy whose diapers I changed, whose birthday cakes I baked, whose little hands once clung to my dress because he was afraid of the dark. When did he learn to speak about my death like a business transaction? When did the love in him rot into something unrecognizable? I waited until they walked away, until their footsteps faded onto the gravel path leading back to the house. Only then did I begin to swim toward the far end of the lake, where the reeds were thick and the darkness deeper. My body ached with every stroke. My right knee throbbed. My heart fluttered dangerously. But I kept going because the alternative was unthinkable. When my fingers finally brushed the muddy bank, I pulled myself onto the shore, panting hard. My clothes clung to me like ice, heavy and suffocating. I lay there for a few moments, staring up at the blinking stars, shivering uncontrollably. The night smelled of lake water and cold earth. A distant owl hooted. The sound should have been comforting. Instead, it felt like an omen. After I caught my breath, I crawled toward the line of trees that bordered the property. There was an old storage shed tucked near the pine grove, an old, forgotten structure where Henry once kept fishing gear. The door was stiff, swollen with humidity, but I managed to push it open. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the faint smell of old canvas tarps. I sank to the floor, shivering so violently that my teeth clattered. I peeled off my wet cardigan and draped a tarp around my shoulders. For the first time since the fall, I allowed myself to cry. Not because I had almost died. Not because my bones hurt. But because the betrayal pierced deeper than any cold water ever could. I cried for my daughter who had grown distant over the years. I cried for Henry who wasn't here to protect me. I cried for the version of Thomas the first once knew. And I cried because a part of me had always sensed this was coming, just never like this. When the tears finally stopped, another feeling took their place. A strange one. A quiet one. Not rage. Not panic. Not vengeance. But clarity. I realized something important in that dark shed. If I went back to the house now, gasping and wet and terrified, they would finish what they started. If I called the police without proof, they would twist the story until I looked confused, unstable, fragile. And if I trusted even one more wrong person, I would not live long enough to see justice. So I made a choice. A quiet choice. A deliberate one. I would survive in silence. I would watch from the shadows. I would let them think I was dead just for now. And then, when the time was right, I would rise again. Not with anger. Not with violence. But with truth. The kind of truth that burns greed like acid. The kind of truth that ends lies. The kind of truth that no one, not even family, can escape. I wrapped the tarp tighter, took one long, steadying breath, and whispered into the darkness. You should never have underestimated your grandma. I didn't sleep the night after Thomas and Linda came by with their calculated smiles and hollow reassurances. I lay awake in my old oak bed, staring at the ceiling fan turning slowly, a hypnotic circle of blades that reminded me how everything in life seems to come back around eventually, no matter how far you try to push it away. The lake outside was unusually quiet, as if it were holding its breath with me, waiting for something to break the uneasy stillness. I kept thinking about the way Thomas kept touching the arm of his chair, tapping it rhythmically, the way people do when they're impatient for the moment they can finally reveal whatever evil they've been rehearsing. The more I replayed his voice, soft, syrupy, falsely concerned, the more I felt something inside me tighten, like a fist closing around my ribs. The morning light came in cold and pale, washing the room in a dull silver that made everything feel even more unreal. I wrapped my sweater tighter around myself and made my way to the kitchen, where the kettle whistled loudly in the empty house. The quiet felt heavier than usual, pressing down on me like a warning I wasn't ready to hear. I poured myself tea, but halfway through the cup, I caught sight of movement on the porch. At first I thought it was just a branch swaying, but then I heard laughter, low, hushed, the kind people make when they're sharing a secret they don't want the owner of the house to overhear. When I opened the door, I saw Linda standing there, holding her phone to her chest like a shield. She looked startled to see me awake. "Oh, Grandma, I didn't want to disturb you," she chirped, though she stepped back a little too quickly, as if caught doing something she shouldn't. I glanced past her and noticed a car idling near the mailbox. It wasn't theirs. It wasn't familiar. And the driver didn't look away when our eyes met. He looked at me with a cold, assessing stare before slowly rolling up the window. "What are you doing here so early?" I asked her quietly because I didn't trust my own voice to stay calm. Linda smiled in that way people do when they believe they're smarter than you. "We thought we'd check on you. Thomas said you sounded overwhelmed yesterday. We worry about you." She touched my arm lightly, her fingers icy. "We're family, Grandma. We just want what's best. What's best for them." That was what she didn't say. I invited her in, mostly because I wanted to keep her where I could see her. As she stepped across the threshold, her eyes darted around the living room like she was cataloging everything she planned to inherit. She paused by the framed painting of the lake, one of the last pieces my late husband had made before his hands began to tremble with age. She didn't look at it with affection or nostalgia. She looked at it like property. "You know," she said casually, smoothing her hair, "Thomas and I think it might be time to consider assisted living. They have wonderful places nowadays. Safe, modern, comfortable, and you wouldn't have to worry about accidents or cooking or—" her voice trailed off as she examined the bookshelf. "Or being alone." Her words weren't subtle. They weren't meant to be. It felt like she was already rehearsing a speech she intended to deliver to someone else, someone official. Someone who could make decisions about my life. I sat down slowly, keeping my gaze on her. "I've lived in this house for 52 years, I said softly. "Alone doesn't frighten me." Linda smiled tightly. "Well, sometimes people don't realize how much help they need until something terrible happens." The way she said it, "terrible happens," made my skin crawl. Before I could respond, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and her expression changed. She didn't show me the message, but she stiffened for a second, then plastered on a bright smile. "Oh, I have to go. We'll check in again later." She didn't wait for me to reply. She practically rushed out the door. As soon as she was gone, I locked every window and door. Something was wrong. Something had shifted. I could feel it settling around me like a fog rolling in from the lake, thick and disorienting. I spent the afternoon watching from the kitchen window, the kettle cooling untouched on the stove, each hour feeling heavier than the last. Every so often I caught glimpses of that unfamiliar car driving slowly past my property, turning around, circling back again. Always just far enough away to pretend it wasn't watching. Always close enough that I knew it was. That evening I called my old friend Martha, a woman whose age had turned her suspicious of every living soul, a trait I now found comforting. When I told her what was happening, she didn't laugh, didn't dismiss, didn't accuse me of paranoia. She only sighed long and weary. "Ellie, you need to be careful," she said. "Money makes monsters out of people who once called us family." I slept even less that night. Every creak in the old house felt sharper, louder. At one point I thought I heard footsteps outside my window, but when I pulled the curtain aside, there was only the moon reflected on the still, dark water of the lake. No movement. No sound. Just silence. But the silence felt wrong. Artificial. Held. The next morning I went out to retrieve the newspaper and nearly tripped over tire marks, fresh ones, cutting through the grass beside my driveway. Someone had driven up to my house in the middle of the night. Someone had come close. Too close. I stood there for a full minute, letting the cold wind whip at my hair, the fear settling deeper. Why were they circling me? Why were they pushing so hard, so suddenly? Why no? Then I remembered Thomas's words. "We just want to make sure you're secure." Their definition of secure was very different from mine. Something terrible was coming. I felt it deep in my bones. And I knew whatever they were planning, Thomas and Linda weren't acting alone. There was someone else involved. Someone watching from the shadows. Someone who wanted me gone. The lake remained silent. Too silent. As if it already knew what they were going to do to me. I woke on the third morning with a heavy feeling in my chest. The kind that tells you before your feet even touch the floor that something is already waiting for you, something unwelcome. The house felt colder than usual, as if someone had opened a door during the night and let the chill wander freely through the rooms. I pulled my robe tighter and walked toward the kitchen, but halfway down the hallway I stopped. The picture frame of my wedding photo was crooked. I knew I hadn't touched it. I hadn't dusted in days. The frame had been untouched for years. Yet now it hung slightly tilted, just enough for someone with observant eyes to notice. It was the sort of detail you ignore if you trust the world. But I no longer trusted anything, not the quiet of the lake, not the shadowed corners of my own house, and certainly not the two people who shared my blood but not my heart. I reached out and straightened the frame slowly, my hand trembling as I did. Someone had been in the house. Not long enough to ransack anything, not foolishly enough to force a door, but long enough to leave a message. "We were here. We can come again." Suddenly the coldness made sense. It wasn't the weather. It was intrusion. Violation. Presence. I moved through each room one by one, checking windowsills, checking locks, checking the dust on the furniture. Nothing was broken, nothing missing. But the sensation of being watched clung to me like a damp shroud. By noon, the uneasiness in my stomach had grown into a hard knot. I kept glancing toward the lake, hoping it would offer me the peace it once did. But even the water seemed darker, almost opaque, like a sheet of glass reflecting nothing. Standing on the back porch, I let the cold wind whip against my face, and that's when I saw footprints, 2 sets near the shore. They were faint, softened by the morning dew, but they were there. One pair was large. The other smaller, like a woman's. I knew instinctively that the larger set belonged to Thomas. I didn't want to admit who the smaller ones might belong to. The lake used to be a place where I found comfort. My husband and I used to sit on the old wooden bench beneath the willow tree, watching the water shimmer under the setting sun. Now the same lake felt like a witness, silent, observant, holding its secrets in its cold depths. It saw everything. It heard everything. And it refused to speak. I went back inside with a resolve I hadn't felt in years. I wasn't helpless. I wasn't senile. And I wasn't going anywhere, not to an assisted living facility, not to the hospital, not out of this house unless I chose to leave. My home had been built on memories, hard-earned, cherished memories, and I wouldn't let greed drag me out of it. If they wanted me gone, they would have to face me, and I wasn't ready to surrender. Around 3 p.m. the phone rang. I almost didn't pick it up, fearing who it might be. But when I lifted the receiver, a shaky breath of relief escaped me. It was Martha. "Ellie," she said, her voice trembling as though she had been waiting for me to answer. "I've been thinking about what you told me. There's something I forgot to mention yesterday." I sat down slowly. What is it? I didn't want to scare you, but, she paused, lowering her voice. Someone came by my house last night. A man. A brown jacket. Said he was checking on elderly residents. But Ellie, he didn't ask about anyone else. Just you. My breath froze. And when I told him I hadn't seen you in days, Martha continued, he asked if you were living alone. Asked if you had any family around. He swallowed. I lied, Ellie. I told him your daughter lives with you. I don't know why, but something about him. His eyes. They didn't look like someone who cared about elderly residents. My heart beat painfully in my chest. Martha, did he say his name? No, she whispered. But he drove off in a dark-colored car. Windows tinted. The same car I'd seen outside. The same stranger who stared at me. Their plan was unfolding faster than I realized. Martha, I said, forcing my voice not to tremble, I need you to do something for me. If anything happens, if I don't call you by tomorrow, you need to call the police. There was silence on the other end, then Martha's voice broke. Ellie, are you in danger? Yes, I whispered, because for the first time the truth felt undeniable. I think I am. After I hung up, I stood in the living room, suddenly aware of how empty the house felt. It was the kind of empty that follows a storm, the kind that comes right before the next wave of destruction. I closed the curtains, turned on every light, and waited. Hours crawled by. The sun dipped behind the trees, painting the water with streaks of red and gold. The colors should have been beautiful, but instead they looked like warning signs, blood mixing with water. Around 8 p.m. I heard gravel crunching outside. I froze. I didn't breathe. The sound came again, slow, deliberate footsteps making their way up the driveway. Someone was walking toward my house. I moved quietly to the window, careful not to make the floorboards creak, and lifted the curtain just enough to see Thomas. And he wasn't alone. Linda followed 3 steps behind him, her face pale, her expression tight, as if she were trying and failing to hide nerves. Behind them, the dark-colored car I had seen earlier idled at the end of the driveway. Someone sat inside, unmoving. I stepped back from the window, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. They were early. They weren't supposed to come until tomorrow. I wasn't prepared. I wasn't ready. Panic surged through me, hot and sharp. Then they knocked. Not a gentle knock. Not a family knock. A hard, heavy pounding that rattled the doorframe. Grandma. Thomas called, voice dripping with fake cheer. We need to talk. The pounding continued. My chest tightened. Grandma, opened the door. Another bang. We're worried about you. Worried. They had practiced that word too many times. I didn't move. Didn't speak. Didn't breathe. Then Thomas's voice changed, dropping into something low, threatening. Open the door. In that moment, every instinct in my body screamed the same thing. They're not here to talk. They're here to make sure you don't stand in their way anymore. And as the cold wind howled outside, something else whispered through the walls of my home, something darker, something ancient, something that felt like the lake itself finally speaking. They're going to do it tonight. The pounding on the door didn't stop. It intensified, each strike echoing through the hallway, vibrating in the wooden floor beneath my feet. I stood frozen behind the living room archway, clutching the back of a chair as if it were a lifeline. The night outside had thickened, the air turning almost suffocating, as if the world itself was holding its breath, waiting to see what I would do. Inside, every light I'd turned on earlier felt too bright, too revealing, like a stage set for a performance I had not agreed to give. They knew I was home. They knew I was awake. And they weren't leaving. Their persistence had the calm cruelty of people who believed they were entitled to whatever they demanded. Grandma. Thomas bellowed again, but this time his voice carried the sharp edge of someone growing impatient. This is ridiculous. Open up. Linda's voice followed, softer but laced with panic. Eleanor, please, we just want to talk. This is getting out of hand. I almost laughed at the hypocrisy. Out of hand? They were the ones pounding on my door after stalking me, after sending strangers to my windows, after stepping around my property like wolves circling a weakened deer. I backed up slowly, my breath coming shorter with each step. My heart kept repeating the truth I didn't want to admit. They don't want to talk. They want control. They want the money. They want you gone. The pounding stopped abruptly. Silence spilled into the house like cold water, making the hair on my arms rise. Silence was worse, far worse than shouting. Silence meant something new was happening. Then I heard it. The metallic scrape of a lockpick entering the bottom keyhole. My knees nearly buckled. Thomas wasn't pretending anymore. He wasn't playing the role of a worried grandson. He was breaking in. My mind raced for a plan, any plan, but fear wrapped itself around me like a hand at my throat. I grabbed the cane leaning by the armchair, not because I needed it but because it was the only thing that made me feel less bare, less defenseless. The scraping grew louder. A click. Another. A muttered curse. Then a final click, sharp as the crack of a bone. They were in. I ducked behind the archway as the door swung open with a groaning creak. Cold air surged into the warm house. Footsteps crossed the threshold, strong, angry footsteps that didn't belong to someone visiting out of concern. Thomas didn't even call my name this time. He just entered like a man stepping into a property he already believed was his. Linda hesitated on the porch, and for a moment I thought maybe she'd run. But then she stepped inside too, her eyes scanning nervously, her breath shallow. And in that instant I felt a strange, fleeting ache, because she used to be kind once. Quiet, gentle, insecure. But greed had a way of twisting the softest souls until they resembled shadows of themselves. "Where is she?" Thomas muttered. "She's hiding. She's finally losing it." Linda whispered, "Thomas, this isn't right. We shouldn't be in here." "Oh, shut up," he snapped. "We're doing this for her own good. She's obviously not safe alone." Those were the words people used before they stole someone's life out from under them. They moved deeper into the house, stepping through the hallway. I held my breath as they walked past the archway without glancing in my direction. I stayed perfectly still, pressed against the wall, my heart pounding so loudly I feared it might give me away. The house creaked beneath their weight. Then Thomas opened the refrigerator. The sound of magnets clattering. The thud of the door slamming shut. "She hasn't eaten much," he said darkly. "This is good for us. If she's weak, the doctors will believe she's declining." My stomach twisted. Linda wrung her hands. "Thomas, please. This isn't what we talked." A glass bottle shattered. She flinched. I flinched too. He'd slammed something onto the counter. "I don't care what you talked about," he said tightly. "I know what needs to happen. And we're running out of time." His voice carried the unmistakable weight of certainty. The kind that only comes from a person who has rehearsed a plan long enough that morality no longer interrupts the script. I crept backwards, inch by inch, until I reached the small cabinet under the stairs. My hands shook as I opened it silently. Inside was the emergency phone I kept for storms, the one they didn't know about. But just as I reached for it, I heard the stairs creak. Thomas was coming up. And he was coming fast. I darted away from the cabinet, closing it softly with my foot. I moved toward the living room, toward the shadows, blending into the darkness like a frightened animal. My breath trembled in my throat. The cane in my hand felt too light, too thin, too insufficient, but it was all I had. Thomas reached the landing and slammed open the door to my bedroom. Then my closet. Then the bathroom. "She must have gone outside," he muttered. "Check the backyard." Linda didn't follow him this time. Instead, she wandered toward the living room slowly, as if drawn by hesitation or guilt. Her footsteps softened near the archway, and I stiffened as she stopped just a few feet from me. "Eleanor," she whispered softly, almost as if she were speaking to the air. "If you can hear me, please, don't make this harder." That was when something inside me hardened, something old, something that had lived within me long before Thomas learned to speak or Linda learned to lie. A part of me that motherhood, widowhood, and aging had never erased. I stepped out of the shadows. Linda gasped. Her hands flew to her mouth. "Oh God, you scared me." "Good," I said quietly, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. "You should be scared." She stepped back, her face draining of color. "Grandma, please, it's not what it looks like." "It's exactly what it looks like." Before she could answer, Thomas thundered down the stairs. He froze when he saw me standing there, alive, alert, unbroken. His shock lasted only a second before something darker flickered across his face. "There you are," he said, smiling a slow, poisonous smile. "We thought you fell." And in that smile, in that one moment, I knew. Tonight wasn't a warning. Tonight wasn't a threat. Tonight was the line they intended to cross. Thomas's smile stretched across his face like a crack forming in glass, thin, sharp, dangerous. He stepped toward me slowly, the way a predator approaches prey it believes is already cornered. Linda didn't move at all. She stood frozen near the archway, her hands trembling, her eyes wide with horror at what was beginning to unfold, and perhaps horror at realizing they had come too far to turn back. The house felt unbearably small. Every wall leaned inward. Every shadow deepened. My breath shook in my chest as I took one step backward, refusing to show the fear clawing up my throat. But Thomas saw it anyway. Bullies always do. "We've been worried, Grandma," he said, his voice soft in the same way poison is soft. "You've been acting confused, forgetful, locking yourself inside, not answering the phone." His eyes gleamed. "You're not safe alone anymore." That sentence, the one he'd rehearsed, fell into the room like a verdict. He wanted it on record. He wanted Linda to hear it. He wanted himself to be the responsible grandson. But there was nothing responsible about the way he suddenly reached for me. Instinct took over. I swung the cane. It struck the side table instead of his arm, the impact making a loud crack that echoed through the house. Thomas flinched, more surprised than hurt. "Grandma," he growled, "don't make this harder." "Get out of my house," I whispered, my voice shaking with adrenaline. "Both of you." His smile returned, colder. "Your house. Oh, Grandma. You must not have read your mail lately. We talked to your lawyer. You signed the property transfer months ago." "Pie what?" The room spun. "I never." "You did." Linda whispered. "Thomas, stop." But he silenced her with a glare. He pulled out a folded paper from his jacket and waved it at me. From where I stood, I could see my signature, my handwriting, slanted and shaky at the bottom. Only it wasn't mine. I knew every curve of my penmanship, every habit, every loop. This wasn't a shaky hand from age. It was a forgery. "You're lying," I said, but my voice faltered because reality was unspooling at my feet. Thomas tucked the forged document away. "Nobody will believe you. We've been telling everyone for months that you're forgetting things. That you're declining." He took another step forward. "That you might wander off one day." A chill ran through me. Wander off. Like a missing person. Like someone who could disappear without questions. "I'm not going anywhere." I steadied my voice. "Oh, but you are," he said softly. "Tonight." Linda gasped. "Thomas, no, please." He didn't even look at her. He lunged for me. I moved before he could grab me, my body reacting faster than I knew it could. I shoved the coffee table toward him, the force surprising both of us. It caught him in the shins, making him stumble. For a moment, just a moment, I had space. I ran. My legs trembled violently as I darted down the hallway, gripping the wall to steady myself. The house seemed endless and narrow all at once. Behind me, Thomas cursed loudly, the sound of his footsteps thunderous and terrifying. I reached the back door, fumbled with the lock, my hands slick with sweat, shaking with fear. The metal clicked just as Thomas shouted, "Get her!" The door swung open and the night air slapped me in the face, icy, punishing, real. But before I could take a step outside, something grabbed the back of my robe. I spun around violently, tearing free from the fabric, stumbling onto the porch as Thomas tripped forward, my robe still in his hand. I didn't stop running. The cold hit me like 1,000 needles. The ground was uneven, slippery with wet leaves. I could hear Thomas behind me, feet pounding furiously. I headed toward the only place that offered cover, the woods between my house and the neighboring property. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. My breath came in ragged gasps. "Stop running," Thomas roared. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. He intended to make me disappear. He intended to finish what he started tonight. The trees swallowed me. Darkness wrapped around me like a shroud. Branches scratched my arms, my face, my neck. My pulse hammered so loudly I could barely hear anything else. But the footsteps behind me, heavy, determined, remained close. "You're only making it worse," he shouted into the dark. I slipped on wet soil and went down hard, my knee exploding with pain. I bit down on my lip to keep from crying out. For a moment the world blurred. I saw my husband's face. I saw my granddaughter's smile. I tasted fear like metal on my tongue, but I pushed myself up. Thomas was close. Too close. "We could have done this the easy way," he snarled. "But you always had to fight." A distant sound rose through the trees, A car passing on the old road near the lake. I turned toward it instinctively, running again, my knee screaming with every step. I reached the clearing near the lake, the moonlight turning the surface of the water to silver. The wind whipped against me, carrying the scent of pine and cold water. And suddenly I stopped. Not because I wanted to, but because there he was. Thomas stepped out from between the trees, blocking my path. He was breathing hard, his face flushed with rage. "Grandma," he said, voice eerily calm now, "you should have just trusted us." His eyes drifted toward the lake. A slow, horrifying smile crept across his lips. "No," I whispered. "Please. You can swim, remember?" he said mockingly. "You'll be fine." But there was murder in his eyes. He grabbed my wrist violently and pain shot through my arm. I screamed, struggling, pulling away with everything I had, but he was young, strong, fueled by greed and fear. "What are you doing?" Linda's voice rang out from behind him, trembling, horrified. He didn't even turn. "Helping her. Helping us. Helping everyone." He dragged me toward the edge of the lake. "Thomas, stop." Linda screamed. "You're going to kill her." "That's the point," he snapped. The world spun wildly. My feet slipped on the wet rocks. The water surged in and out like a living thing, swallowing the moonlight and spitting it back out. Then I don't know how I did it, maybe it was fear. Maybe instinct. Maybe my husband's strength. But I twisted my wrist sharply, slipped from his grip, and shoved him with every ounce of power left in me. He stumbled backward, caught off guard, slipped, and fell into the lake. The splash was thunderous. Dark. Final. I didn't wait to see if he resurfaced. I fled into the night, my body shaking, my breath ragged, every step fueled by terror and survival. I had escaped, but I knew this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The night I escaped the lake, the forest seemed to swallow me whole. My body was trembling from the cold, my soaked clothes clinging like a second skin, my knee throbbing with every step. But despite the pain, despite the terror, a strange clarity settled in me. I am not done. I will survive, and I will see this through. I slipped deeper into the shadows, each branch tearing my clothes and scraping my skin like reminders that I was alive, and that I had to stay alive. The lake, the house, Thomas, Linda, all of it had been a world of betrayal, but now I was outside it, invisible and free. For the first time that night, I felt the old spark of determination return. I knew I couldn't go back to the house, not yet. Not until I understood who had truly orchestrated this and how far the betrayal extended. I found a small abandoned boathouse on the far side of the property, a structure I hadn't noticed in decades, overgrown with weeds, half-rotted boards forming walls that were surprisingly sturdy. I forced the door open, slid inside, and collapsed onto a wooden bench. My muscles trembled, my lungs screamed, but I was alive. Alive and watching. For the next 3 days I stayed hidden, surviving on water I could collect from the lake after filtering with my hands, and small crackers I found in a forgotten storage box inside the boathouse. I rested when I could, nursing my knee with cold water and pressure, avoiding making a sound that could give away my location. Every day I watched the house from a distance. From the shadows I observed their routines, their conversations, the way they moved like people who believed the world belonged to them. Thomas and Linda were careful, yes, but arrogance made them predictable. They didn't know I was alive. They didn't suspect that the Grandma Eleanor they thought they had cornered had outwitted them, even if only barely. And then I began to piece it together. The $11 million wasn't just money. It was insurance, investments, properties, a trust that Henry had built over decades. And the more I watched, the more I realized that it wasn't just greed that had driven Thomas and Linda. It was entitlement. They had spent years thinking this house, these funds, this life were theirs by default. The fake property transfer, the careful erasure of my presence, even the attempted lake accident, it all pointed to one plan. Make me disappear, make the world believe I had lost my faculties, and step into the fortune they believed they had earned. I remembered the man Martha had seen near her house, the one in the brown jacket, driving the dark-colored car. He hadn't been random. He was part of a larger network, someone Thomas had brought in to enforce their plan. And suddenly, everything fell into a horrifyingly clear place. My own family had enlisted outsiders to ensure I couldn't fight back. They hadn't just crossed the line. They had built an entire strategy to erase me from existence. But with clarity came strategy. I was 78, yes, but I had survived worse storms than this. Henry's voice echoed in my head. Quiet people survive storms other folks never see coming. He had taught me to watch, to wait, to act with intention rather than impulse. And now, from the shadows, I began to observe every detail, the timing of their movements, the moments when they left the property, the patterns in their conversations. They were predictable, arrogant, and that arrogance was my weapon. By the fourth day I had moved closer to the house, still hidden, still careful. I learned that Thomas had tried to access my bank accounts remotely, claiming he was helping me manage funds. Linda had been in communication with lawyers who were in on the scheme, drafting documents to make my disappearance appear legitimate. The more I uncovered, the more enraged I felt, but this rage was tempered by a sharper, colder force: resolve. I wasn't going to scream or lash out or endanger myself further. I would dismantle their plan, piece by piece, quietly, carefully. One afternoon I noticed something that would change everything. Thomas had a habit of leaving his laptop open at the kitchen counter when he went to check the mail. His passwords were predictable: dates of his birthday, Henry's birth year, even the name of his old dog. I watched, memorizing every detail of their routines. If I could get close enough, I could access the information, document their schemes, and have proof to dismantle every lie they had built. I also began writing letters to Martha, carefully coded messages hidden where no one would suspect. She had become my lifeline, the person who reminded me that hope was still possible, that justice didn't have to be loud or vengeful, it could be quiet, deliberate, and devastatingly effective. Each note I wrote detailed what I had observed, what I feared, and what I planned. She read every word, understood every nuance, and promised that if something happened to me, she would act. That promise, fragile though it was, became a tether to sanity in those dark, tense days. And then I realized the final truth, the one that made my stomach twist with cold fear and fire. The lake, the house, the threats, they were never enough to intimidate me. Thomas and Linda had underestimated one thing. The person they thought of as fragile, old, and helpless had survived storms, betrayals, and tragedies far worse than this. I wasn't merely surviving. I was preparing. And preparation gave me power. By the end of the week, I had memorized every pattern, every weakness, every move they made. I knew when they left the property. I knew which windows were unlocked, which doors they failed to secure. I knew that greed made them careless. And I knew, most importantly, that I still had the strength, the skill, and the mind to reclaim what was mine, not with brute force but with precision. I looked out at the lake one evening, the surface glittering like broken silver under the moon, and I whispered into the wind, "You pushed me into the water. You tried to drown me. But I'm still here. And I am not afraid." For the first time since that night, I allowed myself to believe I could win. Quietly, strategically, intelligently. Because they didn't just want to steal my money. They wanted to erase me entirely. And I wasn't going to let them. I spent the next morning sitting at my small desk in the church's guest room, the pale winter sunlight slipping through the thin curtains and pooling gently onto the wooden floor. The world outside looked peaceful, birds hopping along the bare branches, a dog barking somewhere far off. But inside me something had hardened. Not anger. Not rage. Something far quieter, far colder. A kind of clarity. A realization that I didn't need to fight loudly to win. I needed only to move correctly in silence, like a woman who had lived long enough to understand that the sharpest knives were the ones no one heard being sharpened. I wanted justice, yes. But more than that, I wanted my story back. My dignity. My breath. They had tried to drown me like an inconvenient memory, and I refused to vanish so easily. So I made a plan, the kind of plan a 78-year-old woman could pull off without guns or shouting or chaos. A plan made of paper, truth, and patience. Because if there's one thing you learn with age, it's patience. Father Daniel knocked gently before stepping in. "Eleanor, I found something you should see." He handed me a thin stack of papers, printouts from the town's property records, bank archives, and insurance filings. He had stayed up half the night quietly digging, bless his gentle soul. And there was the confirmation. The rot beneath the smiles. Thomas and Karen hadn't simply been waiting for my death, they had been preparing the stage for it. 2 months ago, they had filed a family request review, to be added as emergency executors of my estate due to my declining mental clarity. The insurance payout on my life had been adjusted quietly and illegally to make them primary beneficiaries. And the biggest shock of all, A forged medical declaration stating I had early-stage dementia, signed with a clumsy imitation of my doctor's signature. My hands shook, but not from fear. From indignation. From insult. "How dare they?" I whispered, the words dry and brittle. Father Daniel placed a hand on my shoulder. "They've built this for months. Maybe longer. You're dealing with something deeply intentional. Intentional. Planned. Calculated." I was no longer dealing with ungrateful relatives or greedy children. I was dealing with people who had decided that my life was worth more to them dead than alive. And that kind of decision doesn't come from impulse. It comes from cold strategy. But so could mine. "So what do you plan to do?" he asked. I took a slow breath, smoothing the papers against my lap like a woman considering nothing more than a grocery list. "I'm going to let them think they won." His eyebrows rose. "Eleanor." "No," I shook my head. "They need to believe I'm gone. They need to relax. People who think they've won get sloppy." He seemed torn, but then he nodded. "Whatever you decide, you won't be alone." That sentence struck me deeper than I expected. I'd felt alone for so long, years really, while Thomas and Karen pretended to care. To have someone on my side again, it meant something. Later that evening, I dialed a number I hadn't called in nearly a decade. My granddaughter, Lily. When she answered, her voice trembled with shock. "Grandma? Is it really you?" "Yes, darling. It's me." She began to cry, quietly at first, then harder. "Mom said you drowned." "Grandma, I thought you were dead." Her belief wasn't her fault. That was the lie she had been fed. "I'm alive," I whispered soothingly. "And I need your help." Lily didn't hesitate. "Tell me what to do." And just like that, I had my second ally. Young, sharp, and fiercely loyal in a way her parents had never been. Over the next 2 days, we built my quiet revenge like a quilt, piece by careful piece. Lily, being tech-savvy, accessed digital files, saved receipts, traced forged documents back to the laptop her parents used, and collected everything in a folder labeled with an unassuming name, Winter Recipes. Father Daniel contacted his friend at the county office who discreetly verified every legal inconsistency we found. No police yet. No confrontations. Not until the timing was perfect. Not until the trap was ready. Meanwhile, I wrote a letter, a long, slow-burning confession of everything I'd witnessed over the past years. The manipulation. The financial grooming. The fear. The lake. The betrayal. I wrote it not as a victim, but as a witness preparing to speak the truth regardless of the consequences. I sealed it in an envelope and placed it inside Father Daniel's desk with clear instructions. "If anything happens to me, send this to every news outlet in the state." Quiet power. Not loud threats. Control regained. One night while reviewing the evidence, I paused. A realization settled over me like warm sunlight. I wasn't just fighting for money. I wasn't fighting for revenge. I was fighting for the right to exist. To be heard. To be valued. It wasn't about the $11 million. It was about dignity. My dignity. My life. And for the first time since the lake, I felt something gentle unfold inside my chest, hope. I looked at Lily on the small church sofa, cross-legged with her laptop, her hair falling into her eyes as she concentrated. I watched Father Daniel at the table, sorting papers with quiet determination. I wasn't alone. Not anymore. And with allies, quiet strength becomes something astonishingly powerful. A storm was coming, not chaotic, not violent, but deliberate. The kind older women learn to summon only after a lifetime of being underestimated. I was ready. For truth. For justice. For the moment they would realize the ghost they thought they drowned had come back to end the play they had written. The morning was cold but crisp and clear, a deceptively peaceful day that seemed to whisper promises of reckoning. I watched from the shadows of my own living room, an ironic feeling settling over me. The very space Thomas and Linda had once believed belonged to them now held me in full command. I had spent the past week preparing, watching, listening, learning every hesitation, every predictable movement. Quiet revenge is always most potent when your enemy believes you are still weak, still hidden, still afraid. Lily was beside me, laptop open and ready, her eyes bright with nervous energy. She had gathered everything: bank records, forged documents, emails, insurance filings, even the small digital traces of Thomas and Linda's accomplices. Father Daniel had called ahead under the guise of a friendly visit, and promised to stay on the porch as a subtle witness. Every detail had been planned. Timing, evidence, presence of allies. It was meticulous, careful, and lethal in its precision. They arrived mid-morning. Thomas drove slowly down the driveway, Linda fidgeting in the passenger seat, unaware of the true awareness building inside the house. They expected me to be gone. They expected the doors to be empty, the rooms silent. They expected me to be fragile, afraid, erased. Instead, I greeted them with tea. I set the kettle down and poured steaming cups, placing one directly in front of Thomas. He froze for a split second, confusion flickering across his face. "Grandma," he began, voice uncertain. "Yes," I said softly, my words carrying an undercurrent they couldn't yet feel. They had always underestimated the quiet power in old women, the kind that doesn't scream or thrash, the kind that waits. Linda stammered, her voice cracking. "We just came to sit," I said, gesturing to the chairs around my small dining table. "Please, let's talk." I poured a little more tea for myself, deliberately slow, deliberately calm. The ritual, the normalcy, seemed to disarm them in ways I hadn't expected, but that was the point. Control comes from calm. Thomas leaned back in his chair, attempting a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We're worried about you," he said. "After, last week, it's been rough." I lifted my cup to my lips, letting the warmth seep in before I set it down. "Rough? Oh yes, it has been rough. For all of us. But some of us were thinking it might be rough for others very soon." The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. They didn't know what I meant. But soon they would. "Grandma," Linda whispered, stepping forward slightly, "we never meant for—" "To do what?" I interrupted softly, leaning forward. "To push me toward the lake? To forge documents? To manipulate my life, my home, my finances? To pretend I was incapable, fragile, forgotten? That you could erase me?" Thomas's face twitched. Anger, fear, and surprise flickered across it in a rapid sequence. That's not what." I held up a hand, stopping him. "Do you know what I see when I look at you both?" I asked, voice quiet but piercing. "I see a plan. I see greed. I see a family who believes they can write their own rules and erase everyone else from the page. And I see proof. Every email, every forged signature, every conversation, and every movement has been documented." I gestured to Lily, who tapped a key and opened a file on the laptop in front of Thomas. Every document, every trace, every shred of their deceit lay bare. Bank transfers, digital logs, the property transfer, insurance manipulations, even a photo of the dark-colored car outside my house the night they tried to push me into the lake. Thomas's mouth opened, closed, opened again. Linda's hands flew to her face. Their confidence, built on arrogance and underestimation, was crumbling. "You think you can scare me?" Thomas hissed finally, trying to regain composure. I smiled, not broadly, not with malice, but with a quiet intensity that spoke of someone who had survived worse storms than him. "You tried to scare me. You almost succeeded. But you underestimated one thing. I am still here. I am alive. I'm not afraid. And unlike you, I am patient." Linda began to sob softly. "We didn't mean for anything to get so out of hand." "Out of hand?" I asked, my voice steady and unwavering. "You planned to drown me. You manipulated my life. You erased me. That is not out of hand. That is intent. That is calculation. That is betrayal." Thomas slammed his hand against the table, a sudden explosion of frustration. "This is family," he yelled. "We just wanted what's ours, what's always been ours." I leaned closer. "What's yours? You mean what my husband built? What I protected for decades? What you think you can inherit by lying, by intimidation, by violence?" My voice dropped to a whisper, but it carried across the room like a bell. "I will not give it to you. I will not give you me. You cannot erase me." I let the silence linger, letting them feel it, feel the weight of every lie and every misstep. And then calmly I continued, "Father Daniel and Lily have copies of everything. Every illegal move. Every forged document. Every attempt to manipulate my life. If I vanish tomorrow, they will ensure the truth is known. Quietly. Efficiently. Unstoppably." Thomas's face turned red. Linda's knees shook. I could feel the power shift in the room. I had not yelled. I had not thrown anything. I had not even raised my voice beyond necessary. But every word, every pause, Every careful gesture had dismantled them, quietly but completely. You can't do this," Thomas muttered. "I already have," I said softly, leaning back and taking a sip of my tea. "You underestimated me because I am old. You underestimated me because I appear quiet. But this quietness, this patience, it's my strength. And now you will see it in full." Linda finally dropped to her knees, tears streaming down her face. "Grandma, please, we're sorry, we didn't know." "I know," I said, voice gentle now, almost mournful. "And that is why I spared you. Not mercy exactly, but perspective. You will live with this truth. And you will remember it. Every day." The first confrontation was over. Not with violence. Not with shouting. But with truth, exposure, and quiet, deliberate power. They had crossed the line, and now they knew I had not only survived, but that I had everything in my hands to reclaim what was rightfully mine. I poured myself another cup of tea and for the first time in days, allowed myself a small, satisfied exhale. The storm wasn't over. But the first crack in their armor had been made. The days that followed the first confrontation were quiet, almost eerily so. Thomas and Linda no longer carried themselves with the smug arrogance of people who believe the world bends to their will. Instead, they moved with caution, whispered to each other in hurried tones, and avoided my gaze. Every glance I sent their way now carried weight, like a gentle hammer tapping against brittle glass. The first confrontation had planted doubt, fear, and hesitation in them, and I could see it spreading, slow but unstoppable. I continued my careful observation from my hidden vantage points, sometimes from the kitchen, sometimes from the small reading nook near the window that faced the driveway. Every movement they made, every whispered word, every hurried glance toward the locked office where I had hidden the documents, was catalogued in my mind. They were unraveling and I was quietly orchestrating it. Lily had been invaluable. Her skill with technology allowed me to track their digital footprints with precision. Emails, text messages, even casual social media posts revealed their panic and their attempts to cover up every trace of wrongdoing. They had no idea I could see it all or that I had already shared copies with trusted allies in the legal and financial community. Every slip they made was a tiny victory, a thread unraveling from the fabric of their plan. One afternoon, Thomas stormed into the house, clearly agitated, and slammed the door behind him. His face was red, his fists tight. "This is getting ridiculous," he shouted, voice echoing through the small rooms. "Everything we try, it's like she's one step ahead." I sipped my tea calmly, my eyes on him, my expression serene. "Perhaps you underestimate experience," I said softly, almost conversationally. "Or perhaps you simply refuse to see what's been right in front of you all along." Linda lingered in the hallway, glancing nervously between us. I could see guilt and fear etched into every line of her face. "Thomas, maybe we should just wait," she whispered. "Wait?" he snapped, pointing at me. "We can't wait. She's trying to ruin everything." I set my cup down with deliberate slowness, letting the clink of porcelain punctuate my words. "You have already ruined everything by underestimating me," I said. "Every move you made, every lie you told has been documented. Every attempt to manipulate my life, my finances, my freedom recorded and preserved. You may think you've been clever, but cleverness without conscience is easily outmatched by patience, knowledge, and quiet resolve." Thomas's hand shook as he ran it through his hair. He wanted to argue, to assert control, but the words caught in his throat. He could feel the tide turning, but he didn't know how far it had turned or how thoroughly. I rose slowly from my chair, my body straight, my presence commanding the room without a single raised voice. "This isn't about revenge," I continued, my voice soft but carrying every ounce of conviction. "It's about reclaiming what is rightfully mine. You believed you could erase me, make me vanish, and take what I have spent a lifetime protecting. But here I am, alive, aware, and fully prepared to ensure that every action you've taken is reversed. Every attempt at deception, every forged document, every manipulative scheme, you will answer for it." Linda began to cry quietly, clutching her hands together. We didn't know it would go this far." "I see that now," I said gently. "And that is why I am giving you a choice. You can come forward, accept responsibility, and help rectify your mistakes. Or you can continue down this path and the consequences will be much harsher. Quietly, efficiently, and completely. But know this, I am no longer afraid. The tension in the room was palpable. Thomas's jaw clenched, his chest rising and falling rapidly. The realization was dawning on him. His plan had failed. Completely. The one person he had thought fragile, the one person he believed he could manipulate and erase, had survived and quietly gained control. Every door he thought he had closed, every lock he believed secured, every document he thought hidden was now in my hands. I could see the cracks forming. Not just in their confidence but in their relationship. Linda's guilt, once hidden, now bubbled to the surface. She whispered to Thomas, tried to reason with him, and for the first time he seemed unsure. His carefully constructed mask of certainty was slipping, revealing panic and vulnerability beneath. I returned to my chair and picked up my tea, swirling it slowly in my hands as I allowed them to feel the weight of their failure. Silence settled over the room, broken only by the occasional tremor in Linda's voice and the heavy breaths of a man who had realized he had been outmaneuvered. The tide had turned. Not with violence, not with shouting or chaos, but with quiet observation, patience, and strategy. I had gained full control. Every threat, every plan they had tried to execute, now lay exposed and impotent before me. And in that quiet dominance, I felt the first true sense of calm I had known since the night they tried to push me into the lake. From this point forward, the path was clear. I would not only reclaim my home and my finances but also ensure that the people who had tried to erase me understood the consequences of underestimating someone who has lived long enough to know how to survive, how to observe, and how to act with quiet precision. The storm they had tried to unleash on me had been contained and turned. I had survived, I had uncovered the full extent of their plan, and now I was ready to ensure that justice, careful, deliberate, unshakable justice, was finally served. And yet, even in the midst of all this, I felt a strange tenderness. I was not alone. Lily was with me, steadfast and loyal. Father Daniel remained my witness and ally. I realized in that moment that the power I held was not just in my knowledge or my preparation, but in the network of trust and love I had quietly built around me. The next step was inevitable. Part 11 would be the full exposure. The truth revealed to the authorities, the confrontation with legal power, and the final unraveling of Thomas and Linda's plan. The tide had fully turned, and I was ready to see it through. The day the authorities arrived, the sun shone as if it were conspiring with me, illuminating the house with a crisp, clear light. I had spent the night carefully organizing the evidence, double-checking every digital file, every paper, every note, every photograph. Lily had worked quietly beside me, ensuring that nothing was missing, nothing overlooked. Father Daniel had called ahead under the guise of a routine community check-in, ensuring that our arrival would be unthreatened. Thomas and Linda were already awake, pacing in the kitchen when I descended the stairs. Their faces reflected an unusual mix of confusion, anger, and most importantly, fear. They had spent months believing they had covered their tracks, that I was gone, that my life was erased. And now, the people who represented law, authority, and moral accountability were approaching. "Grandma," Linda whispered, voice shaking. "What is happening?" I looked at her calmly, my expression serene but piercing. "The truth," I said simply. "Everything you tried to hide, everything you manipulated, everything you tried to erase, it will all be revealed today. The evidence is ready, the authorities are aware, and no more shadows can conceal your actions." Thomas's fists clenched. "You can't. You already failed," I interrupted, my voice steady and unwavering. "And now it's time to accept the consequences." The knock on the door was deliberate, professional. It echoed through the hallway like a herald of inevitability. I opened it myself, holding the envelope of carefully documented evidence. 3. Officers stepped into the house, notebooks and cameras in hand, ready to record every word, every document, every admission. I guided them through the living room, the hallway, into the study where Thomas and Linda's activities had been carefully logged. "Every document," I explained softly, "every email, every forged signature, every financial transaction, is preserved here. You will see clearly the intent and the planning behind what could have been a tragic act." The officers nodded professionally, taking photographs, scanning documents, and asking precise questions. Thomas tried to interject, to explain, to convince them that this was a misunderstanding, but I simply handed over the files, letting the weight of evidence speak louder than any argument he could muster. Linda began to cry quietly, covering her face with her hands. "Grandma," Hey, please. It wasn't supposed to go this far, we didn't know. I took a deep breath. What you call ignorance is not ignorance. It is choice. You chose to deceive, to manipulate, to attempt to erase me from my own life. Now you must face that choice. The officers spent hours reviewing the evidence, cataloging everything, and interviewing witnesses who had corroborated parts of the story. The forged documents, the insurance manipulations, the digital trails, even the car sighting outside my home, the mountain of evidence left no doubt. By the afternoon, Thomas and Linda were being formally questioned. Their arrogance had crumbled entirely. They realized for the first time that the plan they had spent months constructing was unraveling before their eyes. Each question from the authorities, each cross-reference from the documents, each witness statement chipped away at their false reality. They were no longer in control. They were no longer predators. They were exposed. I watched silently, my heart steady, my mind calm. There was no triumph in anger. There was no joy in seeing them frightened. There was only resolution. The act of survival had led to clarity, and clarity led to justice. Lily stayed close, her hand occasionally brushing against mine. Her presence was a reminder that family could exist in truth and love, not just in blood. Father Daniel remained by the door, quietly observing, a guardian of witness and moral accountability. I realized then that the real power I had gained wasn't just in documents or legal evidence, it was in the network of allies who believed in the truth, who helped restore it without chaos or vengeance. By the evening, the officers had left, and the first steps toward legal resolution were in motion. Thomas and Linda were facing charges for fraud, conspiracy, and attempted endangerment. The insurance companies had been notified, their claims frozen, and the property transfer had been reversed. Slowly, the tide of their intended victory had been turned completely in my favor. Sitting in my chair that night, I allowed myself to exhale fully for the first time in weeks. The house was quiet, the shadows softened by the glow of the lamps, and the weight that had pressed on me for so long began to lift. I thought about the lake, the night they had tried to push me into it. I thought about the fear, the terror, and the helplessness I had felt. And now I realized that those moments had forged something deeper inside me: strength, clarity, patience, and the ability to act decisively when it mattered most. Lily came and sat beside me, leaning against my shoulder. "Grandma," she whispered, you're amazing. I don't know how you did it." I smiled gently, brushing her hair from her face. "I didn't do it alone. You were with me. Father Daniel was with me. And I had something far stronger than fear or anger. I had patience, knowledge, and the will to survive. That is something no one can ever take away from me." I looked around my home, the familiar scent of old wood and winter air filling the room. It felt for the first time in months truly mine again. Safe, calm, and full of quiet power. Justice was underway, but more importantly, I had reclaimed my voice, my space, and my dignity. The storm had passed, but its lessons remained clear. Underestimating someone, especially someone who has survived a lifetime of storms, is a mistake that cannot be undone. And as I sipped the final warmth of my tea, I understood that this was more than victory. It was closure. Not loud or vindictive, but precise, deliberate, and profoundly human. Tomorrow would bring legal proceedings, questions, and further resolution. But tonight, the house was mine, the truth was mine, and I could finally allow myself the fragile, hard-earned sense of peace that comes after surviving the unimaginable. The winter sunlight poured gently through the tall windows of my home, casting soft, golden patterns across the wooden floors. For the first time in months, the house felt alive with calm instead of tension. No more lurking shadows, no more whispered plans of betrayal, no more gnawing fear at the edge of every sound. The storm had passed, and in its wake there was clarity, quiet strength, and peace. Sitting in my favorite chair, I held a warm cup of tea, inhaling the comforting blend of herbs and winter spice. Lily sat across from me, sketching in her notebook, her laughter soft and light as she recounted a story from school. Her presence reminded me that life, even after treachery, could be gentle, nurturing, and full of hope. I looked around the living room. Father Daniel had helped reorganize the space, ensuring it felt welcoming, lived in, and safe. The familiar scent of polished wood and old paper wrapped around me like a comforting blanket. It was strange, the way peace felt heavy and light at the same time. Heavy because of all that had happened, the lake, the betrayal, the legal battles, the emotional toll, but light because I had endured, survived, and reclaimed everything that was mine. My dignity, my home, my voice, my life. Thomas and Linda had been stopped. The legal system was ensuring they could not harm me again, and the insurance companies were reversing their fraudulent claims. The $11 million they had coveted so desperately was intact, preserved, and no longer a weapon against me. But more than the money, more than the legal victories, I realized that the true triumph lay in the reclamation of my own power, my own agency. I reflected on the months that had brought me here. I remembered the night by the lake, the terror and the helplessness, and the astonishing surge of instinctive survival that had carried me through. I remembered the days in hiding, quietly observing, recording, and planning, and how that patience had turned fear into strategy. I remembered the first confrontation when I had spoken softly but firmly, and felt the shift of power as Thomas and Linda realized they were no longer in control. And finally, I remembered the day the authorities arrived, and the weight of truth and evidence dismantled every thread of their scheme. Each moment had been a lesson in vigilance, courage, and quiet determination. But perhaps the most important lesson was this: strength is not always loud. Justice is not always violent. Sometimes it is quiet, deliberate, patient. And sometimes it is rooted not in retaliation, but in reclaiming your life and refusing to be erased. Lily looked up from her notebook, sensing my reverie. "Grandma," she said softly, "are you okay?" I smiled, the lines on my face softened by the sunlight and the sense of accomplishment that filled me. "Yes, my dear. I am okay. More than okay. I am alive. I am whole. And I am finally free from fear." Her eyes sparkled, reflecting a mix of admiration and relief. "I'm so glad you're safe. You were amazing, Grandma. I mean, really amazing." I reached out and took her hand, squeezing it gently. "We were amazing, Lily. You helped me just as I hope I helped you understand the power of patience, courage, and quiet observation. Life can throw storms at us, darling. Sometimes we are pushed into lakes, figuratively or literally. But if we endure, if we watch, if we act with intention, we can reclaim everything that was threatened. And sometimes, even more than that, we can find peace." I thought about the small, ordinary pleasures that had once seemed so insignificant. The scent of rain on the driveway, the warmth of a teacup in my hands, the laughter of a granddaughter, the quiet devotion of a friend. Those were the things that mattered now. Those were the victories no one could take away. Father Daniel entered the room quietly, carrying a small tray of cookies. "I thought you might like a snack," he said, smiling. "It feels lighter here today." I nodded. "It does, Father. Lighter, calmer, safer. And that is a kind of victory all its own." We sat together for a while in silence, drinking tea, eating cookies, and listening to the soft hum of the house. The winter wind rustled the bare trees outside, a gentle reminder that life moved forward, seasons changed, and renewal was always possible. The house was filled with warmth, not just from the sun, but from the presence of those who had stood by me, quietly, faithfully, and with love. I thought again of Thomas and Linda. They would face consequences, yes, and I felt no malice toward them, only the acknowledgement of the lessons they had taught me about vigilance, patience, and human nature. They had underestimated me, assumed weakness where there was strength, and acted with greed where there should have been compassion. But I had survived, and that survival had turned into reclamation, clarity, and peace. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long, gentle shadows across the floor, I closed my eyes and allowed myself to breathe fully, deeply, and with gratitude. I had endured fear, betrayal, and attempted erasure, and I had emerged intact, whole, and wiser. I had survived the unimaginable, reclaimed my life, and discovered the enduring power of patience, courage, and quiet strength. And in that moment, I understood fully that life, even after betrayal, could be beautiful. Even after terror, it could be gentle. Even after storms, it could be calm. I had lived long enough to know that peace is not the absence of conflict, but the mastery of oneself, the reclamation of dignity, and the quiet assertion of truth. Lily leaned against my shoulder, and I allowed myself a small smile, letting the warmth of her presence seep into me. Father Daniel quietly tidied the room, and the house seemed to exhale with us. I whispered into the room, the sunlight on my face, the quiet warmth of home surrounding me. I survived. I reclaimed my life. And I am at peace. And for the first time in months, I believed it completely. The story had ended, not with chaos, not with violence, but with survival, reclamation, and the quiet, unshakable strength of a life fully lived. I had faced betrayal, fear, and greed, and emerged not just victorious but whole. And in that quiet strength I found not only justice but peace.